So now you went there. You studied. You studied in the Hebrew faculty. I studied at
Right.
the overseas.
Well, I just found out we took the same course with
That's pretty cool.
one of the most brilliant scholars I've ever encountered in my life. Historical geography of the land of Israel, or something like that. It was called. It was actually one of the most interesting classes I ever took. He was always, let's look at the evidence, and then we'll make a decision based on the evidence. And a lot of what I encountered in academia was, okay, we've got this thesis we want to prove. How do we prove it? Which is the exact opposite of what you're supposed to do. Really was, let's look at the evidence, and then we'll figure out what it is. Like,
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that. I mean, evidence-based research is what we should be doing. I mean, that's what we demand from, the harder sciences, right? And
that's what I find happening in a lot of historical studies and biblical studies. People will just ignore the stuff that doesn't fit what they want to argue. And so people will gerrymander the evidence of whatever they want, and I've seen that with all kind of things, but definitely in biblical studies that happens as well. In the Jewish community, people don't pronounce the name. It's forbidden.
Mm-hmm.
And I grew up with this idea that this was absolutely completely forbidden. And then later I find out that, well, yeah, it's forbidden now, but when the Messiah comes, it'll be permissible again. In fact, everybody will say the name when the Messiah comes. That's actually right there in the Talmud. And it turns out one of the things that's in there is that the prohibition to speak God's name is not from the Torah. The prohibition to speak God's name is from tradition, and it's a relatively late tradition. There's a rabbi named Hanina ben Teradion who was burned at the stake by the Romans during the Hadrianic persecutions, meaning roughly sometime around 135, 138, sometime in that neighborhood. We don't know the exact year. But he was burned at the stake by the Romans for speaking the name of God the way it's written, or it says according to its letters, meaning he actually spoke the name Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. Of course, the problem is once the tradition really took hold sometime after that, and so by the way, what we're saying is 100 years after Yeshua of Nazareth, there was a rabbi burned at the stake for speaking the name. Wow. And that's corroborated by other sources, which is incredible.
Why would the Romans burn this guy at the stake? I mean, why?
Because they didn't want the Jews to circumcise their children. They didn't want the Jews to observe the Sabbath, and they certainly didn't want the Jews calling upon the name of their God. If we can get everybody to say God, then we can all pull a bait and switch and say it's the same God, right? If we get everybody to say Theos or Deus in Latin. If we get everybody to say the same word, and it's a generic word, if I'm a Greek and I go to India and I say, hey, I worship the same God as you, and his name is Zeus, they'll be like, wait a minute, no, our God's not called Zeus. But if I go to the people in India and I say, hey, we worship the same God, and his name is God, okay? And that was a very popular idea in the Eastern Roman Empire at the time. Mm-hmm. And the Jews were considered sort of backward, that they say, no, we're the only ones who worship the true God, and he has a name, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. So they made this ruling that forbidding Jews to speak the name the way it was written. Anyway, so it turns out this is actually a prohibition originally by the Romans, and then the rabbis have some internal reasons to forbid it as well. But these things line up around the year 150 or 200. By 250, it's the name is don't speak the name. Yeah.
Wow.
That he was burned at the stake by the Romans. So I found a document which has never been published, and it's never been translated into English. And it talks about, and I'm going to actually release this in a study soon, God willing, and he's rebuked by a rabbi because he speaks the name according to its letters. Wait a minute, that means he knew how to speak the name.
Wow.
Right? And the assumption is the Jews didn't know the name, and asked scholars, well, how was his name pronounced? First they'll say, well, we're not really sure, but the best evidence we have comes from, so they'll look at any source in the world, but they won't look at the Jewish sources because the assumption is the Jews didn't know the name. I'm not one of these people who say, if you don't speak the name the exact way that I speak it, which is Jehovah, then you are going to be cast down into the pit of hell. I think that's utter nonsense. So if we call him the right name and we mispronounce it, I don't think he's going to reject us and cast us down to the pit of hell. I think he will accept our prayers, I believe. Look, my name is Nehemia. There's people who call me Nehemia and Nehemiah, and I say, oh, that's fine. Just don't call me Baldy. It's a very kind of sensitive. So, the name of God appears in the Hebrew Bible 6,827 times. Mm-hmm. So it appears actually more than all of the titles combined. We have these wonderful, beautiful titles, Elohim, which is God, and Lord, which is a translation of Adonai. Technically, Adonai is my great Lord. That's more than all the titles combined, actually twice as many times as all. So this is an important name, which, I can only speak as a researcher about the New Testament. I'm not a Christian. I'm not a Messianic Jew. But from the New Testament perspective, I think you have some really strong evidence that it's an important name. You have this talking about Yeshua saying, I came in the name of my Father. I'm, again, paraphrasing. And I'm looking for the passage where he talks about teaching his disciples his Father's name. Help me out here. And people who project this prohibition to speak God's holy name onto Yeshua of Nazareth, I believe that's an anachronism, and that's a whole sidetrack that I don't know if we want to get down. So there are many names in Hebrew which are compound names. We like to call them in scholarship theophoric names. That's a fancy way of saying it's the name of a person who has the name of his God in his name. His friends called him, we know from Chronicles, Eshbaal, which means man of Baal. Baal, which is the name of the pagan deity. Actually, not the name of the pagan deity. It was the title of the pagan deity. The name of the pagan deity was Hadad, but the Canaanites believed that was an ineffable name. They weren't allowed to speak the name of God. It was too holy to speak, so they called him Lord. It's an interesting. So, theophoric names, Joseph is Yehovah Yosef. Yehovah will add. And he's carrying the name of the creator of the universe, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, in his own name, in the name Yosef.
Or Yehoshaphat, right? That's another good one.
It means Yehovah judges. Yehoram is Yehovah is on high, or Yehovah is lifted up. There's also names that have the theophoric element, meaning the name of the God at the end. So, for example, we have Yeshayahu is Yehovah saves, which is the same name as Yehoshua. The only difference is you take the Yeho and the Yoshia, and that's Yehoshua. And if you switch them around, you get Yeshayahu.
Yeah.
Now, wait a minute. Why is it Yeshayahu? The name Isaiah is Yeshayahu, not Shuayahu. It's just not how it works. So the reason there's a question about how to pronounce the name of the Father, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, is because Jewish tradition, going back 1850 years, had a prohibition to speak that name. And the name was preserved. It was preserved underground. And when somebody spoke up, like in the 15th century, and actually spoke it, he was condemned, publicly condemned. And that's how we know it, because we have the letter of condemnation. It's kind of cool. Are called Yehoshua and Yeshua. So that's not even a question. Isn't a matter of dispute. There's never been a question about how that name was pronounced. So people always had that name. There was never a question how to speak that name. So the name Yehoshua became Yeshua in Second Temple times, and that was because the letter He, there were people, Jews, who didn't pronounce that letter, or they pronounced it in a very soft way, and Yehoshua became Yeshua. Okay. So then you come along to Greek times, and there are these really Greek Jews up in the Galilee, and in Greek there's no sh sound. So Yeshua became Yesua. And in Greek, pretty much every name ends in on or us, right? Joseph becomes Josephus. So Yeshua becomes Jesus. And there are people named Jesus who have nothing to do with the man from Nazareth. There are people named Yeshua who are also called Jesus. And there's this amazing. And one of the ossuaries has the name Yeshua on one side in Hebrew, and on the other side it says Jesus. Jesus, right? There's no J in ancient Greek. So in English, they wrote it with a J. When it was originally written as a J in English, nobody pronounced it Jesus. They pronounced it Jesus, just like in Greek. Over time, people who didn't know Greek and Latin, they forgot, and so they started pronouncing it Jesus. But Jesus was the name of some guy who died in Jerusalem, and he's buried in this ossuary that was discovered by archaeologists. And it's not Yeshua of Nazareth. I'm not saying that. On the contrary, it's just some guy. It was a very common name because it was such a common name.
Right. Yeah.
And so Yeshua becomes Yeshu, which then becomes Jesus. I mean, it's just very simple. And when they first wrote that in the English Bible, they were copying it from the German. And the German, to this day, when you have a J, the J is pronounced Yeh. So when Germans write Jehovah, they don't pronounce it Jehovah, they pronounce it Yehovah. And so the point is, Jesus has nothing to do with Zeus. So there's a letter in the Greek alphabet called Zeta, and Zeus is spelled with a Zeta, and Jesus is spelled with a Sigma.
Mm-hmm.
So the two words have nothing to do with each other. One is an S and one is a Z, or the equivalent in English of S and Z. So it's just ridiculous to say that Jesus means "Oh hail Zeus." I mean, only in the made-up messianic language, not in the real language. So maybe it's not fair to blame it on messianic, because there is a kind of a movement called the Sacred Namers, and I think they're the ones who came up with this. But it's not based on any solid scholarship. I can't even say it's based on unsolid scholarship. It's just completely plucked out of thin air.
I don't know where they got it. It's just
they got it
thing.
from the fact that Jesus sounded to somebody like Zeus, but Zeus wasn't even Zeus. It was Zeus or Zevs in some dialects of Greece. And so that had nothing to do with Jesus. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Or even Jesus is probably how it was pronounced. Jesus and Zevs have nothing to do with each other. It's just ridiculous. To date, we found the name Jehovah with the full vowels in 5 Masoretic manuscripts. I've been communicating with somebody from your community, in fact, who wrote to me, and he had done this amazing work where he went through one of these manuscripts and found the name, like, I don't know, many, many times in the Damascus Crown. And I said, hey, would you like another project? And and I sent him a link to now one of the key manuscripts of the Masoretic text, the British Library Oriental 4445, which I've been hearing about for 25, 30 years and never saw until about a week ago.
Wow.
Because I mean, how are you going to get a photo? You're going to go to the British Library? And I learned about a week ago that I can find it online. It's been digitized and scanned by the British Library.
Yay.
We live in this amazing period. So I write to this gentleman and I say, would you be willing to go through, I know it'll take you months, but would you be willing to go through and find places that have Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh with the full vowels Yehovah? 2 days, or maybe 2 or 3 days. And he found 2 cases that definitively have the name Yehovah with the full vowels.
Wow.
So as of today, we have 6 manuscripts.
Wow.
And I've decided I need to look for more. Which in the past I didn't really occur to me, but now there's so much that's been digitized online. He looks through the entire Torah. I don't know off the top of my head how many times the name Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh appears in the Torah, but it's got to be at least in the hundreds. And he finds it 2 times in the entire Torah. And the point is that the scribes, number 1, knew the name, and number 2, were intent on hiding how to pronounce that name.
Wow.
And every once in a while they slipped up and they put in the full vowels. Most of the time they left out the full vowels. The name is actually unreadable because there's a missing vowel in the Masoretic text. But he found 2 instances out of hundreds, maybe thousands in the Torah, which means their goal was to hide this name, and every once in a while they slipped up and let the name be known. So first of all, there's no question that the way the name normally appears in the Masoretic text is with a missing vowel. And I have not heard a satisfactory explanation of why one of the vowels is missing. Usually the name is missing a vowel, except every once in a while it has the full vowels. And those full vowels are Yehovah.
Mm-hmm.
Those full vowels are never Yahweh.
Those
full vowels are never Yahuwah. Mm-hmm. He pointed out that there's places where it has the vowels Yehovah because the scribe was indicating to pronounce the name there as Elohim. And he said there's more evidence in the Hebrew language for the pronouncing the name Yehovah than there is for Yahweh. And he's right. It's been found in 6 Masoretic manuscripts with the full vowels Yehovah. And a few months back, I started doing some actually, even before that, 5 years ago, someone sent me an email and said, you wrote this book, Shattering Conspiracy of Silence, saying that the name is Yehovah. Did you know that's what the rabbis say too? I said, I didn't know that. What do you mean? The rabbis don't know how to pronounce it. Everybody knows that. And if they do know how to pronounce it, it's a secret. And it turns out it is a secret. But every once in a while, in the tens or hundreds of thousands of pages in rabbinical literature, the secret slips out. And I found 11 rabbis to date who say that the vowels of the name are Yehovah. But I found 11 rabbis who say it's Yehovah. And when they say it's Yehovah, they're not proclaiming it from the rooftops. They are hiding it. They're doing everything they can to hide it. I have one